even though we're all doing the collaborative storytelling part of the D&D, um, when we're playing, players have different like experiences entirely because DMs are also on the design side of things. And I think that it is one thing that with this game, which is, I think, more combat heavy than people think it is, and a lot of times, or not combat heavy, but mechanics heavy. And especially when people say like, "Oh, D&D can be anything," and in my opinion, like D&D has rules, it has combat. Uh, is such an important part of it that they dedicate 1/3 of their base books towards just the monsters you're going to be fighting, um, and entire chapters on combat. Many key character features are all focused on combat. um, a lot of the game has to do with that, and so creating a satisfying experience uh, in that aspect of the game, while yes you can create narrative um, tension and storytelling and be very loose with the rules, but if the players can feel that mechanically, then you are achieving the purpose of the game. And this is why, like I always say for people, like there are plenty of other game types out there, and games encourage certain kinds of behavior. Um, so if you have a game, like there are custom rules in the DMG to add other scores, like sanity scores, or honor scores as well, and you kind of have to understand how that would change the game if we were to add that number into it. If we were to say that honor was a stat we have to follow now, then that would encourage or discourage certain kind of honorable or dishonorable behavior, because then players would, have to roll against those stats. And so, considering that D&D is such a combat heavy game and mechanics heavy game, um, you want those things to kind of reinforce the decisions the players are making, the dangers that they're facing, but also to highlight the things that they're good at. You should first start at looking at the players' abilities, seeing all the things that they're capable of, knowing their classes and their features and stuff like that. Then can allow you to be flexible and to consider what aspects or what parts of the games the players can engage in. So, for example, we have clerics. A very clear and obvious feature that they have is turn undead. If you have your scenario, your party that you're familiar with, it shouldn't be too difficult to kind of learn with them as they're leveling up what kind of abilities they have. And do you feel uh, comfortable so far with the combats that you've had and the players' abilities up until this point?
Yeah, I think so for the most part. I think I will have occasionally the fight where I'm expecting it to go and be a little harder, and then I'll be like, oh wow, okay, well, and then maybe have to um, either just spend more time then on kind of the setting and establishing more of that part, or maybe like they have to call for help or something, and then maybe there's some more little guys that get thrown in or something.
Okay. So, few things to consider. For one, are just like the mathematics of the game, right? Um,
Mhm.
there's a 5% chance, of crit, and also there's the whole bounded accuracy things. There's like a general maximum that things can reach to,
Mhm.
especially if it isn't a super min-maxed party. Let's say you're designing your encounter and you have your players. You can kind of see from their general level and their items. They're probably gonna have at level 9, but like a +8 to most things probably. Um,
Yeah.
and so you then can kind of say, okay, if this enemy has an AC of 18, that means for each player 50% of the time they're going to be hitting. Um, and this is what, like I said, this is when we really get into like the crunch of things,
Yeah.
because is that the experience that you're going for in this situation, that this enemy is hard to hit 50% of the time you're hitting, right? Then will they rely on
Mhm.
spells, and they have the ability to then rely on saving throws instead, to then bypass that, right? So you can have still the high AC, but if they have some type of control ability, or something that can hinder it, right, like a slow, then you also got to look at their saves. What are their saves and their bonuses here? A lot of the times when you look at these creatures, the stats give you a lot of information, um, just based on what they're where they're at. There's a Have you ever heard of the monsters know what they're doing?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a great resource to use. Um, but you can really look at the stats and the abilities, and you can see how these creatures are designed. And this is where like the whole design aspect of the comes into play, where you are the one who are designing the encounters and the setup. And this is where like real world tactics and applications uh can affect how things turn out in a session, right? In a scenario where you might expect one side to severely beat out the other, right? We have like these goblins, and this is also kind of why I try to add uh, multiple dimensions or obstacles or something into the maps here. And it's not something that I always did either. Something I had to learn to remember to implement each time, because on a flat board, given like no other environmental factors, no threats of like NPCs in the way who may like be able to get hurt by AoEs or really anything. Given the optimal positioning, um, your players are very likely to win, especially given the way initiative typically works most of the time. Anytime players are outnumbering these things here. But
Mhm.
even then, um, you have to consider like, how do these creatures attack? How do they operate? How are they successful? What do they use to their advantage? And what types of environments are they in? And how would they best use those environments to their advantage? So enemies who know that they can bottleneck you in here and prevent your party from being able to maneuver around very effectively. Enemies who are able to swim and can go deeper underwater, and get away and out of sight of the players. Um, it's one of those things where, because a lot of times it's kind of tossed out the window or uh, forgotten about, when you consider like how far things are underwater and like how far you can typically see underwater, um, without like any light sources really there to show you around, then like most spells that are sight based, aren't as effective. Um, and so if we just look at this little layout here, where we've got this, let's just say this paladin orc here, and we've got these other uh, hobgoblins here on a flat field here. It's very likely that these other creatures, if we were to begin this battle and we were to position it from here, uh, which is about 60 feet away for most of these other guys here, uh, this enemy, who also you want to make sure that they have some type of ranged options, all of your bad guys, no matter what, just like your players have ranged and melee options no matter what. And this is the kind of thing
Mhm.
I was mentioning about like being familiar with the things that your players can do. Many
Yeah.
of your enemies, your NPCs, they can do those things too. um, but I tend to typically see intelligence as the greatest difficulty lever when it
That
comes to
makes sense.
combat. Because if we have this group here, and let's just say that these are just four goblins here, and they want to go ambush this guy. Again, on a plain field here, combat starts. they're out in the open. They shoot some arrows at him. He runs over, doesn't get quite close enough, but if he has some range attacks, probably kills a few of these goblins, and goblins don't have a shot. And this is honestly the thing that gives the Midnight Pact its high survival rate, which is the fact that you often have knowledge. You often have the ability to try to determine when you are engaging in the encounters and trying to ensure that they are on your best circumstances, right? That you've got Heroes Feast up at the time before you go and do so, that you guys are actively, using your buffs before you go head in there and head it in there. But combat scenario against a high CR creature can be overcome, with preparation, with knowledge and understanding. But likewise, a low CR creature, an encounter, can be devastating if they come in with surprise, if they come in with the correct range that they want for themselves, if they have the high initiative, if they can stun some of your party members before you're able to give away any of your buffs here, then that low CR encounter is suddenly much more deadly. And so the real life tactics and logistics is something that you should consider as well, right? So I probably wouldn't have this guy here in the middle of nowhere. I'd probably have, let's just say, he's walking along the area here. These goblins would roll for stealth, um, you know, using the passives of your players here, but also considering, like, again, like the environment, right? Is it windy? Does that make it harder for players to hear things? This is a lot of these things are put in the DMG. The DMG just doesn't do a good job of like explaining to you and like showing you, and it tucks these bits of information in like places you don't expect it. But like there are rules for like same thing with like survival. Is it muddy? Has it been raining often? Is it snowy? Those are all things to consider when you're creating the survival DC, including like the duration. So the same thing goes for combat and for these senses here. So are the players in the dark? Because if they're relying on dark vision, that still counts as a negative to their passive perception scores. If they don't have any light source, they're still in dim light. So considering all those things, having your creatures come stealth up here, you as DM determine like how close they're reasonably able to get. Tasha's I think Xanathar's Guide to Everything has the rules for like hearing, like how, if your passive wisdom is this high, how much are you able to hear? I think if you have like a passive of 20, I think like you can hear someone whispering like a few feet away from you or something like that. Like so even like in your sleep or something. So those are all things to consider. And so then the distance of the engagement, like I said, matters, because if these goblins are able to attack from cover, let's say, from being hidden, they're able to launch a barrage of attacks. Again, you kind of have to gain experience with the game and just to understand, like, okay, all of these goblins with advantage, with with their surprise, they may have this percent of chance of hitting this enemy. They may do around this much damage. Most of the time when people consider what is a balanced encounter, there's no such thing, because if it was balanced, then both sides would complete each other out and that's be it. But most of the time people want exciting or memorable encounter, but typically one side usually has an advantage over another, and there's often a seesaw effect where the advantage starts off on one side and kind of starts to tilt over towards the other side. And so while there are times where there are encounters that are just very simple, just because your party has gotten to that level of strength, right? Which is why I like the minion rules, because minions are like, they're theoretically are regular monsters and things like that, but for your characters of that level and of that strength, they are just minions to you, but they're still a threat. They can still hurt you. They can still really badly turn the tides here. So all of those real things are things to consider outside of the stats of the monsters, right? they set traps? They give themselves cover? Do they position themselves correctly, right? As you start dealing with creatures of higher intellect who work together, do they have any abilities that uh, contribute to working together? So, for example, we throw in this goblin boss here, and one of his abilities is that if there is a goblin next to him, as a reaction, instead of him getting hit, he can grab this goblin and put them in front of him, and they get hit instead. So, that's one way that goblins, can work together. But goblins all have uh, nimble escape. They can all disengage or hide as a bonus action, right? So what that should inform you about what goblins should be kind of doing most turns here is like doing their attacks, disengaging, hiding if they can, um, you know, doing things like that. So that's kind of the
Okay.
basics. Any
Yeah.
questions?
I don't think so. Honestly, it made goblins way more terrifying.
So yeah, consider the tactics. Consider real life things and maneuvers and pincers and things like that that creatures may use, but also to like knowledge. I think that's one of the things that uh, the Midnight Pact is starting to run into is the fact that like typically in a lot of situations you guys have a lot of knowledge over your foes um, or just kind of on even positions. But now that many of you are well known and people seeing some of your abilities, at the very least know like, okay, you are a caster or a magi or a cleric, and so there can be preparations made on the other side, which is why like when the wraiths attacked, they have they have knowledge on the Midnight Pact. Uh they've scoped on them for them for some time. So you may also have in your campaign NPCs or rivals who are maybe have fought the party before, are aware of some of their abilities. Um the other thing I would say, once you get past like and get more familiar with like the numbers and the crunch of it all, and get a feel for like what are the maximum kind of ranges of powers and abilities, but there's also like synergies that can come into play, like Raggy using vulnerability here, the marking, um and other things that can come into play. So there may be encounters as well that are like the players just aren't rolling well, and that happens. Sometimes you're rolling really good and you may think like, oh, this might have been an okay encounter, like suddenly turns deadly. um can't really do anything about that, but yeah. So once you get past all the crunch, and then start thinking about tactics, and then start thinking about the creature's intellect, and start thinking about the ways that they work together, um, then truly consider the terrain, not just like lines of sight, but also obstacles, things that are, you know, maybe the goblins leave things around that they can target and they can explode. Um, but kind of like I was also saying before, like the distances matter a lot as well. If we choose to engage from back here, then suddenly all of these guys with plenty of ranged attacks versus this person with their turns to range attacks suddenly becomes a lot deadlier than if they start combat here and this person can run up and start damaging all immediate. Uh, but then there's also action economy, and so are you familiar with that concept?
Yeah, in terms of like the PCs just get 6 actions to every one of yours. If you have one or the other, but yeah,
Yeah, it's the general principle with the design of the game that the side that has um more actions per round just by default has a higher advantage, even if it is um even if it's just because one side has uh a creature that only hits once per turn and the other side has creatures that hit twice. even if it's because even if it's like one side has a creature with a lot more hit points, um, most other things, even side with more actions, just has more options, more opportunities to do things. It's kind of like what I said, like in the Q&A last time. I don't know if you were there, but about my favorite classes, and it's to me, it's the ones that give you the most options. I like Rogue, plenty of things you can always do on your turn. I like Wizard, the variety of spells you can pick and choose. And I like little classes here and there that let you do little things that give you options that other players may not have. So that's always gonna end up winning out, because even if the creatures, all they're able to do is shove one of the players down and push them prone, everyone else has advantage against that character until the next turn. So that brings us to the next thing to consider, which is conditions and the ways to affect your players, and that could potentially hinder them or help them, whether through the environment, just there being like, okay, maybe these aren't forests, maybe these are toxic pools of acid or something here, um, or maybe they are just poisonous pools as well. So if the players go in there, there's a chance of them being poisoned, um, and that itself can be a huge detriment. Fear, which is often taken care of by Hero's Feast, but that's not always on, so that can work sometimes. uh, but yeah, so all of the conditions and the ways that you can kind of apply those, because even though your monsters, like I said, they have their stats, but they also have all the other options of actions that like the players have. They can choose to shove, they can choose to grapple, they can drink a potion if they have them, they can help one of their allies here, even if you just got little enemies there just to offer the help action to a bigger one. It's still something. And as always, thank you for watching, for listening, and for coming along. I'll see you in the next one.